The Premier's Conference has started in Saskatoon. One of our regular contributors is there, journalist Brian Lilley. Brian, free trade within Canada is one of the big topics of conversation for the premiers.
Yeah, pipe dream if ever there was one. Isn't this why we started Canada? Wasn't this what Confederation was all about? Isn't it actually in the British North America Act, the original Constitution? The answer to all of those questions is yes, and yet it is incredibly difficult to, be able to have construction workers from Ontario go to Quebec if there's a new factory being built. Or did you know that there are different regulations for the size and weight of tires on trucks, 18 wheelers, as you try and transport stuff across the country? Every province has their own little thing where they're trying to protect their internal, group, their internal industry. And it's easier sometimes to trade with the United States than within Canada. I can tell you that, there's been some noises from other premiers, but Doug Ford is making this his mission. The Ontario premier says this is why he's coming. He had an op-ed out recently talking about it. He said in Calgary when he was there for the Stampede that he's finally glad to have some like-minded premiers around the table and hopes that they can make some moves on that. But it's going to be tough for a couple of reasons. One, the premiers at these meetings will reflect regional interests. So are they willing to annoy that one industry that they've been protecting in exchange for access for other industries to other provinces that have been protecting their own industries? I mean, this is what we do in free trade with the US. Will we do it in Canada? It's tough. The other reason, of course, as you well know in Alberta, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who should be providing leadership, he's not responsible for this going away, but he should be providing leadership, trying to get the premiers on side. He's giving effective vetoes on things like pipelines to Quebec or to British Columbia. That doesn't help get Alberta oil out of the province. So there's a lot at play here, and we'll see if they come up with something by the time they leave town on Thursday.
Now, it seems like many of the Conservative premiers are not big fans of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and you can include, who you mentioned earlier, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who went on record at the Calgary Stampede recently saying, I can say just one thing, God help us if Trudeau gets reelected.
Yeah, it's kind of blunt talk, isn't it? I haven't heard that kind of blunt talk from Premier Jason Kenney, although I wouldn't be surprised to hear him say something like that. He will campaign for the federal Conservatives, and he'll even fly out to Ontario to do so in that infamous 905 belt around the GTA, around the Toronto area. Premier Scott Moe, probably not a big fan, but a bit more measured than Doug Ford was. From my understanding, is one of my colleagues, Rick Bell, doing a sit-down interview with him. This is not at the news conference, and at the end, Ford just threw this out there and kind of caught everybody in the room off guard. But of course, Bell went with it. He also said in that interview, it's really interesting if you get a chance to read it. He said that Trudeau talks about wanting to get along with the premiers, work with the premiers. But then Ford describes the prime minister as being more of a dictator, someone trying to force his views on the premiers, and it's my way or the highway with him. So obviously no love lost, but we've seen swiping from both gentlemen at one another, and that's going to continue all through the campaign.
Brian, the feds have given the go-ahead once again for the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. But wait, another lawsuit has been launched by an environmental group to put the brakes on it.
Yeah, a group called Eco Justice. They're saying that this still doesn't take into account the whales off the west coast that will be hurt and damaged by this pipeline going through because of increased tanker traffic. They were, of course, were successful in getting a blockage of it previously and told, no, you've got to consider these things. So the idea that this pipeline was going to be built. I said to you just after the prime minister stepped forward, what was that, the end of June, and said, this is going to happen and we'll start construction this summer. And I said, whoa. The only people that will get work off of this will be the lawyers. And this is what I meant. The construction workers are going to be sitting there waiting for the jobs. The lawyers, they're already getting paid. And they're going to have to battle this out in court. I'm sure there will be other lawsuits as well. And unfortunately, I don't see an end to this. I wish there was, but we'll see how it plays out in the courts. I'm not hopeful for a quick resolution, although I think in the end the government is right and will be able to green light the pipeline. But it's going to be delayed as often as possible by the activists.
Maybe mom was right. I should have gone to law school. Need a lot more money, but Brian, the federal carbon tax is back in the news. Quebec has joined the Saskatchewan court challenge. Alberta's considering a challenge, and New Brunswick has backed out.
Yeah, New Brunswick said, look, we have similar arguments to what's been presented by Ontario and Saskatchewan. It doesn't make sense for us to do the same one. Quebec looked around at the cases and said, okay, our arguments would be most similar to Saskatchewan. So they're going to join as interveners as it goes towards the Supreme Court. As far as Alberta, my understanding is they're still looking, they're still, contemplating if and how, and trying to come up with the legal arguments. Saskatchewan and Ontario argued two very different cases, two different legal arguments, both of them trying to deal with the constitutionality of the carbon tax. In the end, my read of both decisions is that the majority decision that said it was constitutional looked more at issues such as the importance of fighting climate change, to use the most recent case, the Ontario one. That's not what the court was asked to decide, and no one was actually arguing against doing something on climate change. They just argued on the constitutionality, and I felt that the majority decision was not well thought out legal principle. So we'll see what happens when it goes to the Supreme Court. But again, another battle that's going to keep waging in the courts. And so maybe your mother was right. Should have gone to law school.
Brian, Tories and Liberals are fighting over a secret carbon tax known as the Clean Fuel Standards. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, the term secret carbon tax is something that Andrew Scheer, dubbed this with when he came out. I believe it was Monday. He came out with a letter to the Prime Minister saying, "Hey, look, you've got to tell Canadians the true cost of this." And I guess word started to leak out over the weekend that the clean fuel standards are part of the overall Trudeau government plan on a price on carbon, and they're moving towards that, but they haven't said what this clean fuel standard will be, but it will add costs to aviation fuel, to the fuel you put in your car, to your gasoline, to home heating. All the same things that are hit by the carbon tax will be hit by this. And so to what level and to what degree will it increase costs? Some people are saying it could be another 12 cents a liter at the gas pump. Well, that would be quite the shock to a lot of people. The government is just saying, look, we're still, reviewing this. Well, when will we find out? Well, after the election. This is a real opening for Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives, who've been telling you, look, you can't trust them not to up the carbon tax. The Liberals say this isn't a carbon tax. They denied the carbon tax is a carbon tax. It's part of how they won at the constitutional level with the courts. But obviously, when you add those regulations on, it stops it. And remember, I said to you that Andrew Scheer got an out because the Liberals want to rely on regulations to reduce carbon emissions. This is one of those examples. So they can't turn around and attack Scheer, although Scheer did say if he gets in, these clean fuel standards will be gone because Canadians can't afford to pay more.
Brian, there's news that members of Parliament who have decided not to run for re-election this fall will cash in on about $1.6 million in severance payments.
Yeah, so there's a mixture of MPs. There's 39 MPs that are retiring. Some of them will be over the age of 55. They'll take their pension, which, by the way, if you're upset about gold-plated pensions that MPs have, know that Stephen Harper reformed it, even though it hurt him. MPs now have to put in a lot more money. It used to be they would put in maybe $1 for every $5 they'd get that would be put in by taxpayer, and then that would be invested, and eventually you'd get a big pot of money at the end. But now it's even. It's like most people that do have a pension, your employer puts in half, you put in half. And that's a much more fair system. But for the MPs that don't qualify for a pension, maybe they didn't serve the 6 years that you need to qualify. And by the way, at 6 years, you don't get a big pension. It all depends on years of service, like most plans. But if you didn't serve the 6 years or you're under the age of 55, then you can qualify for a one-time lump sum payment of up to 6 months of salary. So that works out to about $90,000. And I know this is going to outrage people, but politics is a precarious business. And if you want people to leave good jobs to go and run for office when they could be out of work in 4 years if it's a majority, in 6 months if it's a minority, then you need to be able to offer them some kind of cushion to get back into private life, to get back on track, because your job security is all in the hands of the voters. So we could have a debate about whether it's too generous, but I think having something there is right. I just haven't thought about what the the dollar level should be and if where it currently sits is the right one.
A Liberal professor got into a lot of hot water online recently saying the Conservatives are the party of the uneducated.
Yeah, well, Professor Amir Adaran. He wants to say he's definitely not a partisan liberal, but he supports an awful lot of their causes. He advises Eco Justice, this group that is trying to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline. He defends the Prime Minister online quite often. He's definitely of that philosophical political persuasion. And he's an activist. So he uses his position as a law professor at the University of Ottawa to, poke the bear quite a bit, to take on causes that will annoy conservatives. And he looked at this data point from Abacus Data, a polling firm, and said, look, they get more support from people that only have high school education or less. Well, it's one poll out of many polls. And by the way, the conservatives and liberals split people with college diplomas. They split people with university degrees. The only place where there's a real disparity actually is in postgraduate degrees. In this poll, the Liberals had 51% of that vote. But what a lot of people took exception to, myself included, is saying, well, they're uneducated. My father didn't go past high school except for, what's that? His apprenticeship. He became a boilermaker. He did industrial construction, built power plants literally across the continent that helped people like Amir Adaran be able to do his work sitting at his computer because, well, there's electricity going to his office. There's an air conditioner to keep his tushy cushy. There's all of this. And those are the people that also pay the taxes that pay his very lucrative public sector salary. So a lot of people pushing back on him. He was even on a radio show and asked by the host, well, do you get why people are upset? And he said, well, they can be upset if they want, but, this is fact. Not really. But he was asked, will you apologize? He said, of course not. He's been taken to task by pollsters of all kinds of other companies that have said, you are fundamentally misreading this data. And by the way, people move their votes between elections, look between elections. He's refusing to do that. He's digging in. I think he's basking in the glory that he's getting some attention and showing that he might be relevant once again.
I've got two words for you, spin doctor. Brian, a multi-faith group wants to build a shelter for homeless veterans, and it looks like the feds are willing to step up to help.
Yeah, it's a group in Ottawa called the Multi-Faith Housing Initiative, a group of from all faiths coming together and saying, look, we've got a problem of homelessness in Canada, in Ottawa in particular, and homeless vets. We need to help them out. So the plan is for a 40-unit complex that would bring homeless vets into a support system, give them a place to live, try and get them back on their feet. And the feds are looking at putting money into it. Now, what's interesting, Hal, is this is on a former base. It used to be called CFB Rockland. CFB Rockcliffe. There's two areas with similar names in similar parts of that town. CFB Rockcliffe, it was an air base during the Second World War. There's still all kinds of housing that was base housing 60 years ago that's now single family homes and townhomes. Well, they cleared out the rest of the base. They closed it maybe 20 years ago. It's been a long process getting it ready to put in new housing developments. And these are going to be some very nice homes going for good money. Well, as part of the rebuild, there's also going to be social housing, and this could include this. So I think overall it's a good policy. And so kudos to the Trudeau government for stepping up and saying they're going to help. And if they get voted out in October, you can be sure that whoever comes in will still be backing this sort of plan.
Brian, the Liberals spent last weekend on Twitter slamming and attacking the pro-life film Unplanned, which is hitting selected theaters through Cineplex starting on Friday.
They did, and there were even attempts to shut it down. I've heard that there are theaters in it may have been Lethbridge actually, where you are, where they've had to hire extra security. There was another theater that canceled the showing because of threats against them. And Cineplex was under intense pressure. And when you say the Liberals, we're talking Justin Trudeau's chief of staff. We're talking top Liberal MPs out there on Twitter attacking anyone that was tweeting about the movie, attacking those that would show the movie, saying that this is wrong. And see, the Conservatives want to open up the abortion debate, and they want to take away a woman's right to choose, which, by the way, our Supreme Court has never found existed. In response to this, this is something to be noted, because corporations tend to want to avoid controversy. So I need to applaud Cineplex CEO Ellis Jacob, and I want to read from part of his letter. I've got it open on my computer here. He said, "In this instance, many of us will have to set aside our own personal beliefs and remember that living in a country that censors content, opinions, and points of view because they are different from our own is not a country that any of us would want to live in." Bravo to Cineplex CEO Ellis Jacob, and shame on Katie Telford, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, and all those other top Liberals who do want to live in a country where top government officials can try and shame and force private companies not to show a film just because they don't like the message.
And you know, you're right, it's the movie mill here. Len Binning, the owner of the movie mill in Lethbridge, he says a lot of his staff were threatened when they also agreed to air Unplanned, and it will be hitting theaters here in Lethbridge as well at the movie mill after it airs at Calgary and Edmonton, I believe, through Cineplex. Award-winning journalist Brian Lilley joining us from Saskatoon. Thanks so much, Brian.
Thank you.